British cinema in the 1970s was supposed to be gritty, grounded, and all about social realism. But lurking beneath the smoke-filled pubs and crime dramas was a strange world of forgotten sci-fi experiments. These weren't polished blockbusters. They were wild, messy, and sometimes downright bizarre attempts to imagine Britain's place in the future. Curious to see how these films dared to predict tomorrow while barely surviving their own decade. Then buckle up. This list is going to surprise you. The Final Program. 1973. What happens when Britain tries to outweird Kubrick? You get The Final Program, a delirious slice of psychedelic sci-fi that looked like it was designed by someone who raided both Carnaby Street and a chemistry lab. Based on Michael Moorcock's cult novel about anti-hero Jerry Cornelius, the film threw audiences into a post-apocalyptic chessboard where science and decadence collided. The plot? Cornelius, a stylish adventurer with a sharp wit, hunts down a microfilm that could unlock the next step of human evolution. Along the way, he crosses paths with shadowy scientists, femme fatales, and philosophical debates about whether the end of the world should be celebrated or mourned. It's equal parts James Bond, Mad Hatter, and Cosmic Lecture Hall, all spiked with early 70s British flair. But the real hook isn't the story. It's the way the film looks and feels. Director Robert Fuest, better known for The Abominable Doctor. Fibes transformed every frame into a surreal painting. The costumes are pure glam rock runway. The sets feel like futuristic art installations, and the music oozes with experimental energy. Watching The Final Program today is like stumbling into an avant-garde museum that somehow plays like an action movie. Critics didn't know what to do with it. Too eccentric for mainstream crowds, too camp for highbrow thinkers, it faded quickly from cinemas. But in hindsight, the film's willingness to embrace chaos feels bold. It's messy, yes, but thrillingly so, like a 1970s time capsule where Britain asked, what if the future belonged to rock stars and mad scientists? In the end, The Final Program is a film that almost dared to collapse under its own ambition. Yet its sheer audacity makes it unforgettable. It wasn't polished, but it was unforgettable proof that British sci-fi wasn't afraid to throw open the doors of imagination, no matter how strange the results. The Mutations, 1974. Now here's one that feels like a nightmare stitched together from both a lab and a carnival. The Mutations, directed by Jack Cardiff, is part mad scientist tale, part grotesque thriller, and completely unforgettable once you've seen it. At its core, it's the story of Professor Noelter, a crazed academic convinced that he can accelerate human evolution by blending people with plants. The results? Let's just say they're not the kind of garden you'd want to water. Donald Pleasance brings a chilling presence as Noelter, playing him with that peculiar mix of soft-spoken intellect and simmering menace. His experiments, of course, don't go according to plan, producing a group of disturbing hybrids who are forced to live in the shadows of society. To drive home its unease, the film even used real circus performers to heighten its carnival-like horror atmosphere. That choice gave The Mutations a raw, unsettling edge that stuck with anyone brave enough to watch it. Visually, the film embraces its low budget, but squeezes out every ounce of style it can muster. Mutant creations wobble between shocking and campy, but the overall effect is hypnotic. You can't look away, even when you want to. And while it masquerades as pure pulp, underneath it's digging into heavy questions. What happens when science tramples morality? Where's the line between genius and madness? Upon release, the movie divided critics. Some dismissed it as lurid trash, others praised it for its sheer audacity. Either way, it was impossible to ignore. Today, The Mutations holds up as one of the most uniquely British takes on sci-fi horror, brimming with imagination, daring, and a refusal to play safe. If The Final Program was Britain's attempt to intellectualize sci-fi, The Mutations was its dirty little secret, ghastly, strange, and totally one of a kind. Together they set the stage for a decade where British science fiction wasn't afraid to push boundaries, even when it stumbled headfirst into the bizarre. Prey, 1977. Sometimes the strangest sci-fi doesn't come from outer space. It comes to a quiet English countryside and wreaks havoc in ways you'd never expect. Prey, directed by Norman J. Warren, is one of those films. At first glance, it looks like a small, contained story about two women living in isolation. But when a mysterious drifter named Anderson shows up, everything takes a sinister turn. Why? Because Anderson isn't a man at all. He's an alien scout sent to study humanity for possible invasion. The brilliance of Prey lies in its simplicity. With hardly any budget to throw around, Warren relies on atmosphere and tension. The countryside setting becomes both idyllic and claustrophobic, a stark backdrop against the unsettling dynamic between the characters. Anderson, played with icy calm by Barry Stokes, slowly infiltrates the women's lives, and the tension builds not through big special effects, but through unease. Every glance, every silence, every slight disruption hints at the larger menace waiting just beneath the surface. The film is often remembered as a sci-fi horror, but it's more than that. It's a study in paranoia, trust, and manipulation. The alien threat doesn't come in the form of laser guns or spaceships. It comes in the shape of a stranger who looks just human enough to be dangerous. It's Britain doing sci-fi on its own terms, eerie, intimate, and unsettling. Critics dismissed Prey when it was released, calling it too slow or too strange. But over time, it's gained a cult following for exactly those reasons. Its minimalist style feels oddly modern, almost like a precursor to today's elevated horror or stripped-down indie sci-fi. What it lacked in spectacle, it made up for with psychological punch. In a decade filled with forgotten experiments, Prey stands tall as one of the boldest. It didn't need sprawling sets or big explosions. It just needed one alien, two humans, and a countryside that suddenly felt like the most dangerous place on Earth. The Mind of Mr. Soames, 1970. Imagine being born into the world as a grown adult with the mind of a child. That's the haunting setup for The Mind of Mr. Soames, a British-American production directed by Alan Cook. Terence Stamp stars as John Soames, a man who has been in a coma since birth and is finally awakened through experimental medical technology. What follows is not a celebration of life, but a deeply unsettling exploration of innocence, exploitation, and the cruel realities of modern society. Stamp delivers one of his most fascinating performances, balancing wide-eyed wonder with heartbreaking vulnerability. Watching Soames experience the world for the first time is both beautiful and uncomfortable. At first, doctors and scientists treat him like a miracle of progress. But as he begins to act like a child in a man's body, curious, impulsive, and overwhelmed, he quickly becomes a problem to be managed, rather than a person to be nurtured. The film pushes hard on the contrast between scientific achievement and human compassion. Just because something can be done in a lab, should it? The characters surrounding Soames wrestle with that question, but the tragedy is that Soames himself has no say in his fate. He's studied, judged, and eventually pushed beyond his limits, all in the name of science and spectacle. Visually, the film is restrained, with its futuristic edge hiding in sterile laboratories and clinical corridors. That choice makes its impact even sharper. Instead of flashy effects, the unease comes from human behavior. This isn't sci-fi built on aliens or outer space. It's about what happens when progress forgets to protect the very people it claims to save. Audiences in 1970 weren't ready for such a sobering, emotionally charged take on science fiction. The film faded quickly, overshadowed by flashier genre entries. But looking back, The Mind of Mr. Soames feels remarkably ahead of its time, a precursor to the moral dilemmas explored in later sci-fi classics. It's proof that sometimes the scariest future isn't about monsters or machines, it's about us. Zeta 1, 1970. Now for something completely different. If the Mutations was grim and mister. Soames was heartbreaking. Zeta 1 is what happens when British sci-fi crashes into swinging London and refuses to apologize for it. Also known as The Love Factor, in some markets this film is a psychedelic mashup of espionage, spoof, and intergalactic oddity. The premise? Alien women from the planet Angvia are secretly infiltrating Earth while a hapless British spy stumbles into the chaos. From the very first scene, you know this isn't serious sci-fi. It's campy, colorful, and filled with the kind of wild ideas only the early 1970s could produce. The costumes are outrageous, the sets are painted in bold psychedelic palettes, and the plot bounces around like a comic book on caffeine. At times, it feels like a lost Austin Powers film, except it actually came before Mike Myers ever donned those famous glasses. What makes Zeta 1 memorable is its absolute commitment to its own ridiculousness. The alien Angvians, led by the mysterious Zeta, represent a full-on swing at female-led cosmic power, while the men chasing them bumble around with all the competence of sitcom characters. It's tongue-in-cheek to the core, and it never takes itself seriously, which is exactly why it still entertains. Critics at the time? Brutal. They tore it apart for being shallow, silly, and incoherent. And they weren't wrong, but in dismissing it, they overlooked its charm. Because buried in the chaos is a snapshot of 1970s British pop culture colliding with sci-fi. It's as much about the fashion, the style, and the mood of an era as it is about alien invaders. Today, Zeta 1 is celebrated by cult film fans who appreciate its fearless absurdity. It's not high art, and it's not trying to be. It's a bizarre, glittery reminder that British sci-fi wasn't always about darkness and doom. Sometimes it was about painting the galaxy in wild colors and inviting everyone to the party. No Blade of Grass, 1970. While Hollywood was churning out space odysseys and dystopian thrillers, Britain gave the world something darker and disturbingly grounded. No Blade of Grass. Directed by Cornell Wilde, this adaptation of John Christopher's novel flips the sci-fi script. There are no aliens, no ray guns, no space battles. Instead, it's a brutal look at what happens when an ecological disaster wipes out crops and pushes humanity into survival mode. The film follows a middle-class English family attempting to flee London after a global famine sparks chaos. Their journey north is less a rescue mission and more a slow descent into barbarism. Roads become war zones, neighbors become enemies, and every scrap of food turns into a matter of life and death. It's dystopia stripped of gloss, showing not what could happen in some far-flung future, but what might happen tomorrow if the environment collapses. What makes No Blade of Grass unforgettable is its refusal to sugarcoat anything. The violence is stark, the choices are grim, and the morality is murky. There's no noble hero here, only ordinary people forced into extraordinary cruelty. It was a shocking contrast to the optimistic space race imagery dominating the early 70s. The movie bombed critically, with many finding it too bleak and cynical. But in hindsight, it feels eerily prophetic. Long before eco-sci-fi became trendy, No Blade of Grass warned of environmental collapse, societal breakdown, and the thin veneer holding civilization together. It may not have spaceships, but this film belongs in the sci-fi conversation because it asks the most terrifying question of all. What happens when science fails us and nature takes back control? The Boy from Space, 1971. Some of the strangest, most haunting British sci-fi of the 1970s didn't come from cinemas. It came from the classroom. The Boy from Space began life in 1971 as part of the BBC's Look and Read educational series, meant to teach children reading skills. But what they got instead was a deeply unsettling slice of sci-fi that left its young audience wide-eyed and terrified for decades. The story follows two children who discover a mysterious boy wandering in the English countryside. He barely speaks, seems alien in both behavior and appearance, and is hunted by sinister figures with mirrored sunglasses and eerie silence. Slowly, it becomes clear he isn't from Earth at all, but from another planet, and his presence drags the children into a story of danger, pursuit, and cosmic mystery. What makes The Boy from Space unforgettable is its atmosphere. For something meant to be educational, it was filmed with stark, moody landscapes and long stretches of uneasy quiet. The alien boy's strange behavior, staring, twitching, mimicking speech, gave the show a surreal edge, while the shadowy villains felt genuinely threatening. For children expecting a light-hearted reading lesson, it was nightmare fuel of the highest order. Unlike most serious British sci-fi films, this one seeped into everyday life. It wasn't a one-off at the cinema. It was shown in classrooms year after year, imprinting itself on an entire generation. Adults who saw it as children often recall it with both fondness and lingering dread. Critics rarely mention it because of its educational origins, but in truth, The Boy from Space is one of the most effective British sci-fi tales of the 1970s. Its stripped-down storytelling, eerie visuals, and slow-building sense of menace show that you don't need a big budget to make something unforgettable. In the end, it was meant to teach kids to read, but it also taught them a lesson in fear and wonder. That double impact makes The Boy from Space one of the strangest and most overlooked sci-fi creations Britain ever produced. A Clockwork Orange, 1971. Stanley Kubrick may not have been British, but A Clockwork Orange was a thoroughly British production, filmed across London and surrounding towns, cast with UK actors, and drenched in a futuristic vision of Britain that still feels chillingly possible. Based on Anthony Burgess's novel, it presented a dystopian society where violence runs unchecked and the government turns to science to force obedience. At its center is Alex DeLarge, played with unsettling brilliance by Malcolm McDowell. Dressed in his bowler hat and white overalls, he leads a gang of young criminals in a spree of ultraviolence. But the film takes a darker twist when Alex is caught and subjected to the Ludovico technique, a brutal form of psychological conditioning that robs him of free will. Is it science fiction? Absolutely. Kubrick wasn't interested in spaceships or ray guns. He was dissecting the future of psychology, medicine, and social control. The treatment Alex undergoes is presented with terrifying plausibility, raising questions about whether stripping someone of choice makes them better or simply destroys their humanity. The film caused an uproar on release. Critics hailed it as a masterpiece and condemned it as dangerous in the same breath. It was eventually withdrawn from UK cinemas for decades after Kubrick requested it be pulled, following accusations it inspired copycat crimes. That controversy only cemented its legend. Visually, A Clockwork Orange is unforgettable. Brutalist architecture, surreal interiors, and a mix of classical music with futuristic imagery create a world that feels both familiar and alien. It's Britain, but twisted just enough to feel like tomorrow's nightmare. Today, it remains one of the most famous and infamous British sci-fi films ever made. Its vision of a controlled, conditioned society is as relevant now as it was in 1971. More than 50 years later, it still forces us to ask, is a man without choice really a man at all? The Bedsitting Room, 1970. If you think British sci-fi was all spaceships and alien encounters, think again. The Bedsitting Room, directed by Richard Lester, is one of the strangest, darkest, and most overlooked post-apocalyptic films ever made. Based on Spike Milligan's absurdist play, it imagines a Britain destroyed by nuclear war, but instead of bleak landscapes and gritty survival, what we get is black comedy laced with surreal sci-fi despair. The survivors are a gallery of eccentric characters stumbling through the ruins of London. Police still ride the underground, barking orders to an empty public. Nobility still clings to titles even as their homes crumble. And in the most surreal twist, people slowly mutate into objects. A woman becomes a cupboard, a man turns into the titular bed-sitting room. It's absurd, unsettling, and hilarious all at once. Unlike American nuclear disaster films, which often leaned into fear or spectacle, the bed-sitting room captured something uniquely British: gallows humor in the face of annihilation. It doesn't ask how society would rebuild after the bomb, it asks whether society would even realize the world had ended. Critics at the time didn't know what to do with it. Some praised its audacity, others dismissed it as incoherent nonsense. Audiences largely ignored it, and it slipped into obscurity. Yet, revisiting it today reveals a film decades ahead of its time, mixing satire, sci-fi, and existential dread into one bizarre package. Its imagery remains unforgettable. Characters wander a bombed-out London that looks both familiar and alien, and the film constantly blurs the line between comedy sketch and cosmic tragedy. It's not just a forgotten sci-fi, it's one of the boldest examples of how Britain in the 1970s was willing to take risks Hollywood wouldn't touch. In the end, the bed-sitting room isn't about radiation, politics, or even survival. It's about absurdity, the idea that even at the end of the world, people cling to habits, rituals, and nonsense. And maybe that's what makes it one of the most chilling and funniest British sci-fi relics of the decade. Doomwatch 1972, eco-horror and sci-fi. Crossed paths in Doomwatch, a film spun off from the popular BBC series of the same name. Directed by Peter Sasdy, it follows Dr. Del Shaw, played by Ian Bannon, as he investigates a remote island where the locals seem strangely aggressive and mutated. The cause? Toxic waste dumping at sea, creating both environmental devastation and human disaster. At first, the setup feels like a slow-burn mystery: quiet fishing communities, suspicious glances, whispers in pubs. But as Shaw digs deeper, the true horror unfolds. The contamination has altered not just the fish, but the very people eating them. Deformities, aggression, and paranoia spread, and suddenly the island is less a quaint getaway and more a chilling warning. What makes Doomwatch fascinating is its grounding in real-world anxieties. In the early 70s, pollution, industrial waste, and environmental collapse were creeping into public consciousness. This wasn't space fantasy, it was sci-fi horror rooted in fears audiences could imagine happening outside their own homes. That realism gave the film an edge, even when its pacing occasionally stumbled. Critics were mixed. Some thought it lacked the intensity of the TV series. Others praised it for daring to take environmental issues seriously before it was fashionable. And though it faded quickly at the box office, it lingered in memory as one of the few British sci-fi films that tried to scare not with aliens, but with the consequences of humanity's own carelessness. Today, Doomwatch plays like a grim prophecy. Decades later, when we talk about toxic waste, rising seas, and ecological collapse, its message feels sharper than ever. Forgotten by many, it deserves to be remembered as the British sci-fi that dared to ask, what if the real monsters were man-made? Memoirs of a Survivor, 1979. By the late 1970s, British sci-fi cinema had grown darker, more experimental, and deeply introspective. Few films captured that shift better than Memoirs of a Survivor, directed by David Gladwell and starring Julie Christie. Adapted from Doris Lessing's acclaimed novel, it isn't flashy or effects-driven. Instead, it's a haunting, dreamlike vision of a collapsing society and one woman's struggle to survive in the ruins. Christie plays Dee, a middle-aged woman living in a nameless British city after some unspecified catastrophe. The streets outside are filled with gangs, crumbling buildings, and desperate survivors. Inside her flat, though, things get stranger. A mysterious wall in her home begins opening into other realities, revealing glimpses of both the past and an alternate, dreamlike existence. The film moves slowly, deliberately, blending dystopian grit with surreal, almost mystical imagery. Its power lies not in spectacle, but in atmosphere. Scenes of collapsing social order, children scavenging, mobs roaming, the government disintegrating, feel eerily prescient, while the wall's visions blur the line between memory, fantasy, and parallel. World's Julie Christie carries the film with quiet intensity, making Dee both vulnerable and resilient. Her performance grounds the film's shifting layers of reality, giving it emotional weight even when the narrative veers into abstraction. On release, Memoirs of a Survivor baffled audiences. Many found it too slow, too enigmatic, and too grim. It failed commercially and slipped quickly into obscurity. But today, it feels like one of the boldest and most overlooked pieces of British sci-fi from the decade. Instead of chasing spectacle, it dared to explore survival, memory, and the fragile nature of reality itself. If Star Wars promised escape, Memoirs of a Survivor forced audiences to stare into the abyss of collapse. It's a forgotten British sci-fi that still lingers, quietly daring viewers to confront the end of the world, not with laser battles, but with silence and reflection. Quatermass, 1979. If there's a single name that defined British science fiction, it's Quatermass. Beginning in the 1950s as a BBC serial, the character of Professor Bernard Quatermass became a cultural touchstone, mixing horror, mystery, and scientific speculation. By the late 1970s, the legend returned in a darker, more cinematic form. Quatermass, sometimes released internationally as the Quatermass Conclusion. This final chapter finds an aging Quatermass, played by John Mills, investigating strange alien lights and disappearing young people across Britain. What he uncovers is terrifying, a vast alien harvest of humanity, where entire groups are being spirited away for purposes too enormous to comprehend. Unlike earlier Quatermass stories, which balanced optimism with terror, this one leaned fully into despair. It's grim, atmospheric, and apocalyptic. Shot with a bigger budget than previous TV serials, the film combined haunting rural landscapes with eerie cosmic imagery. Stone circles, alien beams, and mass disappearances gave it a folkloric edge, making the alien threat feel less like invaders from the sky and more like ancient forces returning to claim the Earth. That fusion of science fiction and folk horror gave Quatermass a distinctive mood, one that still lingers decades later. Critics were mixed. Some hailed it as a fitting, if bleak, conclusion to the Quatermass saga. Others complained it lacked the tightness of earlier installments. But audiences who saw it on the big screen never forgot its haunting imagery and its sense of inevitable doom. Today, it stands as both a relic and a warning, a relic of a time when British sci-fi could merge philosophy, folklore, and paranoia into one package, and a warning of how fragile civilization feels when set against the vast, indifferent cosmos. So there you have it, 13 strange, scrappy, and utterly unforgettable British sci-fi films from the 1970s. Some aimed high and fell flat. Others embraced the bizarre, and a few quietly predicted futures we're still grappling with today. Which one surprised you the most? And more importantly, which deserves a comeback? Drop your thoughts in the comments, hit that subscribe button for more deep dives into forgotten cinema. And remember, sometimes the weirdest experiments leave the deepest scars in movie history.